So before I start the proper preaching tonight, I have to admit something to y'all about my sermon process. Because I am a lectionary man through and through. So anytime Paul emails me to ask if I'm available, I will check my calendar, make sure I'm free, I'll agree to it, and after agreeing, I will check what the text is that week. Now, so I did that weeks ago when Paul asked me about this one, and for a second the scripture seemed familiar before I realized I had preached this exact week before here 3 years ago. Same readings, same congregation, also the day before Martin Luther King Day. And if I admit it, it honestly wasn't a very good sermon. So please forgive me if I have a rough go again. That might be a little more forthcoming than I should be, but that works because today I want to talk about tact. And I'll start off with a little thought exercise. Imagine, if you will, that you were at a dinner party of a very, very old friend, someone who has been there for you all your life, cheered you on, checked in on you when you were sick, held you when you cried, and helped you out when you needed it. And she has spent the entire day preparing a special meal of all your favorite things, and you see in it the care that she has put into all of this, to a perfect meal and a lovely home, and unfortunately this has not paid off. The food is terrible. Everything is underdone, or too dry, or too runny, and you're not sure what that thing is in the potatoes, but it's awful. So it's all you can do to swallow everything down without letting it show on your face, and at the end of the evening, hearty conversation dispensed of, and a truly horrendous meal sitting in your belly, she asks you how it was. Be honest, she says. Do you tell her? Yeah, me neither. Okay, Estelle does. It goes against everything we are taught about living in community to be that critical of someone who's treated us well and who's tried their best and of whom we are quite fond. We're taught to be honest with one another, but such brutal honesty directed to our friends is going too far, we would think, unless we are either very close to them or very rude. Such frank talk can hurt feelings, threaten close friendships, and in some cases provoke anger from those we'd rather not offend. I say all of this because, like many people, I tend to look past the second part of the reading in 1 Samuel tonight. We're all, I presume, familiar with the comedy of errors, Samuel hearing God's voice and assuming it is Eli's 3 times before Eli finally gets it. But few really engage the next part of the story in which Eli asks Samuel to reveal the prophecy to him. The lectionary itself considers this part of the story optional. It gives us the option of cutting the story off at verse 10, which is right after Samuel invites God to speak and before God actually says anything. And I imagine that the people who plan the lectionary do this on account of the same tact, this hesitance to say anything that is too mean, because the prophecy, as you've heard, is not a super nice one. To review the story, Samuel is considered a miracle birth to an infertile mother who then pledges her son to God in gratitude. As soon as Samuel is weaned, he goes to live in the temple and study God's teachings. He begins this preparation to be a prophet before most of us have learned our shapes and colors. He's taught these things by Eli. Now, Eli is not only the priest of this temple, but one of the last judges of Israel. I mean, he calls the shots in a lot of ways. He's an important figure, and this being before they had a king in Israel, he occupies a similar role to that. He has essentially raised Samuel from a boy, prepared him for a career in ministry, or what you would call it, counseled him through whatever troubles of youth may have arisen, and he's been an attentive teacher. Which makes it all the more difficult to Samuel when his very first prophecy from the Lord is all about how angry God is with Eli, how she plans to cause Eli's family line to come to ruin, punish them all, and how no amount of repentance can still God's anger in this case. Samuel agonizes over this prophecy. He doesn't sleep the rest of the night, wondering how he can tell his mentor and, in a way, father figure all of these things that he's been told by God. It's a fine situation for God to put Samuel in, and a great beginning to a career of ministry. To Samuel's credit, he doesn't hold back. He's like Estelle. He tells Eli everything, and to Eli's credit, he does not lash out. He says, let God do what seems good to her. Still, just thinking about this is agonizing to me, because here's my thing. I really like it when people like me. Even if I don't particularly care for them, I still want everyone around me to be happy all the time, and especially happy with me. This has gotten me into trouble before, and even while I say this, I have a bit of a flashback to a coworker who I once asked a few too many times if she was feeling all right, who snapped at me and screamed, "Not everyone has to be happy all the time. It's okay for people to have feelings." She used the same sing-song voice there. It happens. But so the thought of telling someone something I know will make them unhappy makes me squirm. I'm just not the bad news guy. I'm the guy who, after breaking up with someone I went on 3 dates with, dresses like a Disney villain because that's how I feel inside. And that's not even a made-up story. So I commend Samuel here for being willing at God's behest to tell someone the absolute truth, even when it's not pretty, because I couldn't do that. But sometimes that is what God requires of us. There are unpleasant truths in the world that need to be spoken, and the unfortunate part of being prophetic is that we have to speak these unpleasant truths. And it's not always awkwardness we risk. Sometimes this is dangerous. Sometimes those we speak to are not sadly resigned like Eli, but are angry, maybe violent. And to respond to God's call for prophetic words and acts requires us to face up to this and risk possibly having violence done to us. Today we honor a man who took those risks, the risks of discomfort, among many others. Because pacifism aside, the tactics of nonviolent protest are not about tact. Showing someone the injustice they practice requires making them uncomfortable. To tell them that, yes, you are being a racist is hard enough because we know the backlash they'll give us. But beyond this, nonviolent protest requires inconveniencing people. Sit-ins disrupt business. Marches disrupt traffic, leaving many people angry sitting on a road going nowhere. Not that that's a metaphor for society or anything. And anyone who has ever ridden on a city bus knows the anger that certain people can experience when they are denied a seat. Discomfort is the point, and if you are like me, making people uncomfortable is really hard for you. Now, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement he represents to us embodied this, and to many at the time, they were going too far in inconveniencing everyday people to accomplish these goals. But it was always the everyday people they needed to reach. Because often we need to be made uncomfortable before we can change. And certainly in that era, people needed to realize that their comfort in society was a problem because it relied on the oppression of an entire class of people. Today, the same debates rage. People still debate the ethics of blocking traffic and rioting. Even nonviolent protest still draws ire from many. Think of how many people you know who became positively apoplectic because an athlete silently knelt during the national anthem. These acts draw ire not because they are irritating, but because they draw attention to the unpleasant truths we would rather ignore. They make us uncomfortable. And many of us need to be made uncomfortable, to pay attention to the fact that our comfort is built on the backs of others, still suffering after all this time. We need that moment of irritation to encourage us to notice the suffering going on in our world and think about the ways we contribute to that and the ways that we might change things. And for some of us, that does the trick, and for others, we are so married to our delusion of how great the world is that we'll fight to maintain it. We will get violent and angry at those who never created the injustice and pain but dared to talk about it. In some unfortunate cases, our need to live in pleasant lies rather than unpleasant truths will cause us to literally shoot the messenger. We will kill over this. It's a problem. So, I ask us to exemplify the attitude of Eli here. Yes, at times we must speak unpleasant truths, knowing that the listener needs to be made a little uncomfortable in order to realize that not all is well. But also we must be willing to hear these things. And that's really the message that I need to tell you all tonight. I can talk to you about speaking unpleasant truths to others, and that's a necessary lesson to learn. But in a way, that's easier. Because then, the problem with preaching the example of Samuel is that it lets us feel like the heroes. We're the bold ones standing up against injustice. And don't get me wrong, standing up against injustice is really important, and I hope we all learn how to do so. But here's my other point. Picturing yourself as the one who stands up to injustice feels really good. You get to feel like a crusader for the rights of others, and even if we're actually wrong, you get this nice sense of moral clarity where you feel like you're blameless and others are at fault. Do you know what's less fun? Is being on the other end of the unpleasant truth. Letting go of the illusion of that you are the brave crusader and admitting to yourself that sometimes you are the king in the castle defending an unjust order because it's more pleasant for you. Sometimes we are the ones sitting in traffic wishing the protesters would shut up so we can get home to our partner and relax. Sometimes we're the man on the bus asking the woman to move back because we've had a hard day at work and we'd like to sit. Sometimes we're the ones at home wishing that football player would shut up and play instead of making us think about how we're part of the problem. And sometimes we're Eli, who's allowed his sons to blaspheme the sacred temple for a long time and who's being called on it. And make no mistake, Samuel is absolutely the hero of this story and Eli is not. Eli's a good man, not the villain, but certainly not the hero. But we are an MCC church, so we love to speak out against injustice and play the hero and the prophet. It's easy for us to cast ourselves as Samuel, and much more difficult to see the ways in which we're Eli, in which we resent people who bring up an uncomfortable topic because it reminds us that we are complicit. That is harder. And I want to avoid any hypocrisy here by saying, me too. When some people start talking about justice issues, I can completely agree with everything they're saying and still resent them because of the ways they bring it up. Because maybe they're too aggressive for me, or too quick to place blame, or they simplify the point, or they just use too many buzzwords. But maybe it's also the message that's too bitter a pill for me to swallow because it forces me to confront the ways in which I am a part of the problem. How the smaller comforts of my own life cause me to ignore the greater injustice of the world we live in. It's difficult to face that, and a lot of times I just decide not to, and then I lecture people on their tone, because that's easier, and then I get to still picture myself as the brave crusader for truth, which is a starring role, and only features a supporting actor playing the person who admits that he messed up and is wrong. So I want to apologize, because I did tell you that this story was all about how hard it can be to speak uncomfortable truths, and it is. But I meant to say that I want to make you think of how hard it can be for others to share unpleasant truths with you. I hope it's some consolation to know that when I started writing this, I felt the same way as I did earlier. But so if you've spent the first half of this sermon nodding and thinking about how hard it is for you to speak unpleasant truths to others, I want you to consider the way that someone might feel when they have to say those things to you. Consider why they may feel uncomfortable and think about the fact that they still feel like it was important enough to bring up. Learning how to deal with these critiques is hard, and we will all get defensive and make excuses instead of engaging sometimes, because it doesn't feel good to be Eli, not the hero or the prophet, but the humbled judge admitting he was wrong and trying to do better. It's hard work, but it's crucial. So let's together go back to that first thought exercise I mentioned and be honest. Let's say you're the other person now. You've spent the whole day preparing dinner, spent a decent part of your own wages on the food, put your blood, sweat, and tears into that meal, into cleaning dishes and making yourself and the house presentable. And at the end, you ask your friend to be honest and to tell you how they felt about the food. And what they say is that the food was amazing, even though it wasn't. But that while they're being honest, they have to tell you that some of the conversation made them uncomfortable. They tell you to think that you shouldn't be so quick to blame marginalized populations for the ways they speak out against injustice. And they tell you that you should better examine the ways in which you're complicit in the impression of others and think about how you might change your own actions. Do you accept this? Do you, in that moment, take a long, hard look at your speech and actions and think about how you can be better? Do you thank them for being blunt and bringing unpleasant truths to your attention so you can examine your place in the world? After you've slaved all day, do you this good friend comfortable in your home and show them a good evening, do you peacefully accept their honest critique, pledge to examine your fault, and ask that God do what seems good to her? Yeah, me neither. Let's change that.